Welcome. In this series of talks, I'm going to explore the first few centuries of our Christian faith, from about the time of Paul's first writings in the middle of the first century, through to what's known as the Council of Chalcedon in AD 451. I'm not going to talk about what happened, when and where and who did what, although there's going to be some of that along the way, of course. Neither am I going to chart the development of Christian liturgy or worship. Rather, my aim is to explore the development of Christian thought, of Christian ideas and theology in those essential first centuries of the Church. Why, you might well ask? Why study the theological deliberations of the early Church? Why not simply study the Bible, especially the words of Jesus? Now, let me be clear from the outset. Studying the Bible is of utmost importance. But the Bible is not a systematic theology. That is to say, it doesn't give us a fully worked out compendium of Christian beliefs, and for that matter, neither was Jesus a systematic theologian. And this means that questions remain. For example, when we say that Jesus is the Son of God, what exactly do we mean by that? After all, in the Psalms, King David is referred to as Son of God. And sometimes in the Old Testament, Israel as a whole is described as Son of God. Is Jesus Son of God in the same way as them? Or do we mean something different? And if so, what? Now, to answer this and many other questions, we have to reflect carefully and critically on our sources of revelation, primarily, of course, our scriptures. And this is exactly what the first Christians did. Now, of course, this is an ongoing task, and so the development of Christian thought is a 2,000-year-old story. However, much of what we believe as Christians today, whether we are Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, whatever we believe was largely forged in the first few centuries of the Church's life. Now, to be honest, this is a big subject. And so I'm going to need to pick and choose things a little, and I'm going to have to break things down into more manageable pieces. So in this first part, what I'd like to do is look at the emergence of Christianity from Judaism. That's a particularly important subject from about the middle of the first century to the middle of the second. We'll then turn our attention to a subject that you may not have heard before, which is Gnosticism. What is it? What influence did it have on Christianity? And how did the Church respond to the challenge that it posed? And this will take us to the end of the second century and on to the beginning of the third. Now that's going to be the first part of these talks. And then later in the autumn, I hope to continue the story by looking at the debates surrounding the Trinity in the third and early fourth centuries, and finally the debate about the person and nature of Jesus Christ that followed. Of course, there are many topics that I could touch on, but it's these early debates that define the foundations of what today we would consider to be orthodox Christian thought. Now, saying the word orthodox reminds me, I'm going to use a couple of terms, orthodox and Catholic, quite a bit. Now, this is orthodox and Catholic with a small o and a small c. In other words, I'm not going to be using them in a denominational sense, which of course didn't exist in the early church. Rather, I'm using them in their original meaning. So orthodox comes from the Greek, ortho meaning correct and doxa meaning belief or opinion. So orthodox literally means correct belief. And the word Catholic, well, that also comes from the Greek, katholos, which means according to the whole. In other words, the universal church, as opposed to a particular Christian group or community. And as you'll probably hear, these terms are pretty much interchangeable at this stage of our history. Finally, before we get going, I should say that I don't claim any great originality in these talks. Rather, apart from getting back to some of the sources, which is always important, I'm largely sharing with you the scholarship of others, especially found in 3 classic textbooks from the period. That's Christopher Rowland's Christian Origins, Jesus and Judaism by E.P. Sanders, and John Kelly's Early Christian Doctrines. In addition, I've also drawn on Alistair McGrath's excellent book called Heresy, and other more general information comes from books by Robin Lane Fox called Pagans and Christians, and The First 1,000 Years by Robert Wilken. And I'll put links to those books in the description in case you want to look them up. But I have to say that the first 3 that I mentioned, they are very scholarly books. They're not books to dip into for a light read. The other 3 are perhaps better suited to lay people. So our journey begins with the emergence of Christianity from Judaism. Now, it's important to remember that Jesus and his disciples were Jews. You see, much of our Christian history seems to have lost sight of this important fact. Time and again, I would say, Christianity has understood itself in opposition to Judaism. Thankfully, in the second half of the 20th century, this religious amnesia was somewhat corrected, at least in the academic world, largely thanks to the work of people like E.P. Sanders, who wrote what has become the seminal book on the subject, Jesus and Judaism. You see, Christianity didn't start life as a brand new religion. Rather, it started as a movement within Judaism. Now, mind you, it wasn't the only one. In the first century, several strands of Judaism were vying for people's attention. We find some of these in the New Testament, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who had quite different traditions. But there were others. Most notably, if you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you've probably also heard of a Jewish movement called the Essenes. So we have several Jewish groups in the first century, and Christianity, basically, is one of them. And so, despite our popular conceptions, when we speak of the first Christians, we shouldn't think of them as converts. That is to say, converting from one religion, Judaism, to another religion, Christianity. But instead think of them as part of a movement within Judaism itself. After all, they shared much in common with other Jews. They shared the idea of covenant. They saw themselves as heirs of Abraham and Moses. They also worshipped in the temple and synagogues. You know, one of the things that often strikes people when they read the Acts of the Apostles is that Peter and the other disciples worship in the temple after the ascension of Jesus. That is, they continue to identify themselves as Jewish. And Paul, when he goes off on his missionary journeys around the Mediterranean, where does he go first? He goes to the synagogue. Why? Well, Paul was Jewish. Now, I know we celebrate the conversion of Paul, but in all honesty, he continued to think of himself as Jewish. Now, that's important, I think, to understand. Now, having said that, there were, of course, things that set the followers of Jesus apart from other Jews. Most importantly was the belief that God's promised Messiah, his promised anointed king, had had arrived in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And although he'd been executed on the cross, he'd been raised from the dead, thus confirming his messianic identity. Now, you might say, well, that means there's a huge difference between Christians and Jews. But in truth, it's no more of a difference than existed between some of the other groups. So, for example, the Pharisees believed in life after death. But the Sadducees, well, they didn't. Now, surely this is a pretty fundamental area of disagreement. So I don't think it should surprise us too much that Christians could believe that the Messiah had come in Jesus Christ, while still seeing themselves as Jewish. Now, this is the situation in the first couple of decades after the time of Jesus. But scroll forward 50 years to the end of the century, and Christianity and Judaism were pretty much two separate religions. And this is the first real story of our talks, the separation of Christianity from Judaism. But before we look at the emerging theological differences, I think it's important in this first talk to begin by describing some of the historical context. That is the real life setting that encouraged, or at least paved the way for that separation. The first thing to say is that there were tensions from the very beginning. There are several examples of the first Christians being persecuted by Jews, not least in the martyrdom of Stephen, the first Christian to die for his faith in Christ. And of course, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles, standing by, approving of the stoning, was Paul. Later, and I guess with some irony, Paul was himself persecuted. He tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that he was imprisoned, that he was stoned, and that he was flogged, which was the traditional synagogue punishment. And the evidence for this doesn't only come from Christian sources. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence comes from the Roman author Suetonius. In his book on the lives of the Caesars, he tells us of an event that happened in AD 49 during the reign of Claudius. He says that there'd been some considerable tension between the Jews in Rome over someone called Chrestus. And this tension resulted in the emperor expelling them from the city. Now, although we can't be 100% sure, it seems highly likely that Suetonius made a mistake, and that instead of Chrestus, he meant Christus. In other words, he appears to be describing an argument between Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews. So there's tension from the very beginning. The other thing that's going on is a demographic shift in the Mediterranean world. It's important to understand that in the first century, Judaism wasn't concentrated in a single geographical area, what today we call Israel. Obviously, Israel was the Jewish homeland. But ever since the Babylonian exile, way back in 586 BC, they'd spread out across the ancient Near East. And then since the days of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC and on into the Roman Empire, Jews continued to spread throughout the Mediterranean world. This meant that Gentiles often came into close contact with Jewish communities. And we know that some of them were drawn to the Jewish monotheistic faith. These people were often referred to as God-fearers. And yet they weren't really Jewish. Why? Because they weren't ethnically Jewish. At its heart, Judaism is primarily the religion of a particular people. And the second reason is because they hadn't completely submitted themselves to the Torah, that is the Jewish law. And in particular, they hadn't been circumcised. So we have a Jewish population spread throughout the Mediterranean world, and we have Gentiles who are drawn to the Jewish faith, but aren't completely assimilated into it. And it seems that this is one of the reasons why we see the separation of Christianity from Judaism over the course of the first century. You see, if you look at Christian missionaries like Paul, it's clear that they were very successful in converting Gentiles, probably these God-fearing Gentiles, to this new Christian form of Judaism. But on the whole, they were much less successful at converting ethnic Jews. So as this narrative plays out over the course of the first century, whereas in the early days the majority of Christians were Jewish, by the end of the century, they're mostly Gentile. And this encourages a pull away from Judaism. But perhaps the greatest turning point came as a result of the Jewish-Roman War, which lasted from 66 to 73 AD. In 66 AD, some Jewish revolutionaries led an uprising against Rome, and as you would expect, they were brutally put down. Then in 70 AD, disaster struck. The Romans destroyed the temple, an event that was memorialized in the Arch of Titus, and it's still there today. If you go to visit Rome, you can see the original Arch of Titus with its depiction of the temple menorah and sacred trumpets being carried off by Roman soldiers. Now, the reason this had such an impact on our Jewish Christian story is that following the loss of the temple, Judaism radically changed. After the war, much of the diversity within Judaism started to disappear as they regrouped around what today we know as Rabbinic Judaism. And this Rabbinic Judaism, which is essentially the Orthodox Judaism that we see today, well, that defined what it meant to be Jewish. 1, follow the Torah. 2, worship in a synagogue. And 3, not to be Christian, not to follow the Messiah. So, as we can see, there were lots of changes on the ground that meant that a split from Judaism was probably inevitable. But what really tore them apart more than anything else was theology. And this can be seen in the debate surrounding Christians and their relationship to the Torah, that is, the teaching of Moses found in the first 5 books of the Bible. And that is our subject for next time. God bless.